Well, welcome everyone. I think we have a couple of newcomers, and then we have a studio audience for the first time since we've been doing this. So welcome to them. Um, what we've been doing is a 5-week series called Christianity in America, the broadest strokes possible, covering a myriad of topics. And really the shift that we're making this week from last week to this week is the most drastic. Last week, we talked about the Acoma Pueblo and the interaction of Native Americans and the Spanish. And today our topic is mainline denominations in the Protestant church. So we've gone to about the widest topic you can have in Christianity. And I imagine most of you have heard that term, mainline denomination. A less common term that's used for the same grouping of churches is the Seven Sisters. And who we were referring to when we use either term, mainline denominations or the Seven Sisters, are the 7 denominations that I'm going to name in the order of their size as of today. So those include the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the American Baptist Church, the United Church of Christ, and the Christian Church, which is normally referred to as the Disciples of Christ. Well, this term mainline Protestant was coined during the great debates between the modernists and the fundamentalists in the 1920s. I've read several places that claim the term is derived from the Philadelphia Mainline. If any of you know Philadelphia culture, the Mainline are the most prominent suburbs as you make your way out from the center city to the outskirts. And literally it was the stops along the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad that gave name to these churches, because there were 7 tall steeple churches along that railroad route. Now, I actually believe that's true, but it's more important that it's symbolic. By the 1920s, the power base in America had switched from the farm. A viceroyalty, a new Spain. Whoops. There was a new governor. Uh-oh, that's an old, that's last week's talk.
Yeah, I will, I think I know who I have to go through.
Okay. Now, by the 1920s, the power shift had taken place, moving from agrarian America to urban America, and the power of the churches had followed at the same time. You can look around almost every American town and city in the 1920s, and each of these denominations were basically planting a franchise all across the United States, particularly the Northeast and Midwest. As middle or upper middle class members of the community moved in, it became almost like pledging a fraternity to pick which house you would want to join. And you would pick it maybe because of how you were raised, or maybe because of your business connections. But almost everyone in these small towns ended up joining one of those mainline denominations. 80% of all Christians at the turn of the last century, in 1900, were members of one of these 7 denominations. That still meant that 20% was a large number of people that were worshiping at either Catholic churches or other brands, but we didn't have that whole panoply of denominations like we have today. That really began in the debate between the mainline churches and what became known as the Fundamentalist Churches. So the dividing line became whether a community was embracing modernism or not. When we talk about modernism in the church, we're talking about an embrace of higher criticism and biblical studies. We're talking about theologically more progressive views. And that's what was taking place as we saw Christian liberalism emerge, and with its ethical counterpart, the social gospel movement. Anti-modernists were best summed up by the editors of a publication called The Fundamentals, A Testimony to the Truth, which was an eventual collection of 90 essays gathered in 12 volumes between 1910 and 1915. That book, The Fundamentals, is where the name fundamentalism came from. Now, in this debate between modernism and old style Christianity, there was also strong pushback within the Roman Catholic Church. Rather than the Roman Catholic magisterium adopting this new rationalism and embrace of science, they doubled down on tradition and authority to an even greater extent. Now, we're Episcopalians, so we consider ourselves both Catholic and Protestant. But I imagine for many of us, it's fascinating to learn that what we might have thought were two ancient positions of the Roman Catholic Church only emerged as their response to modernism. What I'm talking about are the doctrines of the Immaculate Conception, which is not Jesus' virgin birth. The Immaculate Conception is the virgin birth of Mary, and the doctrine of papal infallibility. We think of those probably as ancient practices of the Roman Catholic Church. It's not so. They came out of modernism in their negative response. Immaculate Conception became dogma in 1854 and papal infallibility in 1870. Well, something very different was going on in the mainline Protestant churches, so that by the 1920s, modernists had taken over the hierarchy of all 7 of our denominations we're talking about today. What that meant is, as a group, they were pushing for theological changes on new trends in biblical scholarship, embracing what would be called natural theology and the natural sciences. Change was considered to be a source of progress.
I'm trying to do many things. Thank you for that, though. There's a lot of them, too.
Oh, okay. Change became equated with progress. And really, the goal was to make Christianity more accessible and relevant to the citizens of modern America. You find this in a lot of the theological writing of the time. You'll see Martiners thinking behind the denial of the supernatural claims in Scripture. You'll see a number of theologians writing about Jesus as simply a moral teacher rather than an image of a supernatural Messiah. And I think what really brought that debate between modernism and tradition to a head was the church's engagement with the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin had as big an impact on Christianity as Isaac Newton did. And all churches had to wrestle with this new theory that was making its way into every manifestation of life, economics, philosophy, education. Our churches in the Mainline embraced it. Other churches doubled down. And so really you began to see a falling out of which congregations, of which denominations were embracing the new science. How many of you have seen the movie or the play Inherit the Wind? It was a great movie with, so you remember Spencer Tracy playing Clarence Darrow in that. That was based on what were called the Scopes monkey trials of 1925. William Jennings Bryan, a fierce traditional Presbyterian, as well as a long-standing presidential candidate, represented the traditional view, and Clarence Darrow, an avowed agnostic, represented the modernist view. It became the show trial of America, and it became a reckoning point for which churches stood on which side of the new science, and Darwin won out among the mainline churches. As Jason Lancer observed in his book, Mainline Christianity, the Past and Future of America's Majority Faith, he said, quote, by the 1940s, a period of tranquility and near consensus began to emerge within the Mainline, for with liberals ascendant both politically and judiciously and growing in their control of the Seven Sisters hierarchies, it seemed just fine to ignore the conservatives and the fundamentalists all together. Well, this embrace of modernist thinking was not some foreign principle to the mainline denominations. It was actually something they helped create. In 1881, 80% of the colleges in the United States were church-related and private. And while there were some Catholic and Jesuit schools, the vast majority had strong connections to the mainline denominations. The Episcopal Church was not nearly as prolific in founding colleges as, say, the Methodists and the Presbyterians, but still our church launched such institutions as Bard College, Hobart, Trinity College in Hartford, Kenyon in Ohio, the University of the South, and Lehigh, as well as our two traditional colonial schools started by Anglicans, the College of William and Mary and Columbia University. These liberal arts colleges provided a fertile environment for the emergence of modernist consensus in our denominations. The rational principles of the Enlightenment, coupled with the new science, became the new source of moral teaching. An educated clergy. That was one of the key proponents that led to our more progressive, liberal, and modernist thought, is very important in all 7 of those denominations. And that clergy, under their new education, learning about biblical criticism out of Germany, learning about natural science, they became like a vanguard for the changes from tradition to modernism. I think a good example to give of how important this idea of engaging this new idea into the civil society was the founding of the American University in Washington, D.C. That was founded in 1893 by the Methodist Church, specifically to create a national Methodist university for training those who would enter public service and government. Well, as we're beginning to move towards this new modern consensus among these denominations, it's natural that we also move to a deeper ecumenical movement. One of our featured denominations, maybe the one you're the least familiar with, the Disciples of Christ, was actually founded in the early part of the 1800s as an attempt to bring all Christians together under a return to the most ancient and primitive forms of Christian expression. That denomination got started with what was called the Restoration Movement during what we call the Second Great Awakening. And at first it was a loose association of Baptist, Presbyterian, and Congregational churches. But then with a handshake in 1831, 2 leaders of 2 factions of this movement agreed to launch what became known as the Christian Church, or the Disciples of Christ. In the beginning, it was really more a movement than a denomination, but it adopted a slogan: in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; and in all things, charity. So for the Disciples of Christ, there was no requirement to give assent to any other statement or belief or creed, nor was there any official way to interpret the scriptures. Their return to weekly communion as part of capturing the primitive practice of the church was probably their most radical practice in the face of what was going on in all the other Protestant churches in the 19th century. So the Disciples of Christ, the Christian Church, became a denomination, and it was a highly educated, moral and ethical teaching community. And they founded several journals that really became central places where not just their members, but all the Protestant churches could see this new way of thinking. In this ecumenical movement, the Episcopal Church played a very important part when in 1886, we adopted what was known as the Lambreth Quadrilateral. This was our attempt to try to unite all the different Christian churches together, primarily the Protestant churches, but it was something we extended as a a olive branch to all Christians. And what we said is, we are willing to merge with any other denomination who will recognize the Nicene Creed, the Old and New Testament, the sacraments of communion and baptism, and will adopt some historic form of governance that could include our understanding of bishops. So that was our contribution to the ecumenical movement that came out in 1886. So with all this ecumenical movement and all of this consolidation around more liberal modernist thought, finally in 1908, a truly structural approach to ecumenism was adopted with the creation of what was called the Federal Council of Churches. Got started at a meeting in Philadelphia in May of 1908. It came about at the exact same time that the social gospel movement had taken off all across the country. And so the very first important public statement that the Federal Council of Churches adopted was its social creed of the churches. Here's what that included: equal rights and complete justice for all people in all stations of life, protection of the worker from dangerous machinery, occupational disease, injuries, and mortality, abolition of child labor, regulation of the conditions of toil for women to safeguard their physical and moral health, a living wage as a minimum in every industry, provision for the old age of workers, and finally, the abatement of all poverty. So this is modernism at its most utopian. And all of these were principles that had come out of what we know as the social gospel movement. That social gospel movement got started in our urban areas in the beginning of the industrial age because of the terrible, terrible working and living conditions of exploited labor. Up until then, Protestants had been primarily focused on individual sin and redemption in order to lead to salvation and eternal life after death. The social gospel movement turned that on its ear. They said individual salvation isn't important, collective salvation is important, and we can't wait until the afterlife. It needs to happen here and now. Walter Rauschenbusch was the primary theologian of this movement, and he wrote in a book called A Theology for the Social Gospel making clear that sinfulness of the individual had been adopted by the church, but what about institutional sinfulness? And he said, the church has not evoked faith in the will and power of God to redeem the permanent institutions of human society from their inherited guilt of oppression and extortion. Hand in hand with the social gospel movement was the settlement house movement that took root in almost every major American city, sponsored by Protestant churches. Jane Addams and Hull House in Chicago was the first and most important example, but all across America, settlement houses became the most concrete expression of the social gospel. And we had a great example here in Seattle. First Presbyterian Church in Seattle, with its longtime pastor, Mark Matthews, is considered a primary example of the social gospel movement. Pastor Matthews came to Seattle in 1908. And if you can picture Seattle in 1908, it was a wild and raucous place. And from 1908 until his death in 1940, he became a prominent, not just local, but national figure promoting social gospel tenets against civic corruption. His primary target was our famous mayor of that time, Hiram Gill, and all of his business cronies. First Presbyterian Church in 1920 had 10,000 members. It was the largest Presbyterian church in the United States. In 1912, Mark Matthews was elected what they call the convener of the national church. And he built a new building that's not that cement building that we have now, but the old new building that was a model church. It had night schools, it had an unemployment bureau, it had some of the first kindergartens in town, it had an anti-tuberculosis clinic, and it had the nation's first church-owned radio station. Many of you know University Presbyterian Church in the campus area. That was founded as a Bible study by Mark Matthews for university students. And now it's become the largest Presbyterian church we have in our region. So this Mark Matthews and First Presbyterian really stand as a great example of what we talk about when we talk about the social gospel movement. Well, the Federal Council of Churches became the National Council of Churches in 1950. And by that time, there were 38 participating denominations, not just the 7 that we've been focusing on. In the area of mainline ecumenical work, a parallel development got started in 1960 with what was called the Consultation on Church Union. On December 4th, 1960, Eugene Blake, the stated clerk of the United Presbyterian Church, was invited by Episcopal Bishop James Pike to preach at Grace Cathedral. And in that sermon, he proposed the creation of a Protestant superchurch. After that, with the Presbyterians taking the lead, invitations were extended to the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, and the United Church of Christ to explore a concept not just of ecumenical partnership, but of actual structural union into one denomination. The first church to be invited to join what's called COCU, beyond the first 4, was the Disciples of Christ, and then others came aboard after that. It's interesting, the Lutherans never became part of this. Their history in America and their allegiance to Martin Luther and the Augsburg Confession, for them became a barrier to this kind of deep ecumenism. So the Lutherans were never in this dialogue about the formation of a super denomination. So we get to the time in May 1966, they started having annual meetings. And at the May meeting, Time magazine reported that the group had adopted a timetable for a full merger that called for the creation and ratification of a union plan within 13 years, followed by 30 years of federation, during which a constitution would be prepared. By then, there were 10 participating members in the consultation, including 3 traditionally African-American churches. Well, as I said, they're seeking to go beyond coordination to actual merger. And a very important meeting was held in St. Louis in March of 1970. And there, a plan was approved for full merger. The plan presented doctrinal provisions on scripture, church worship, procedures for organizing what was going to be called Church of Christ Uniting. That was going to be the name of the new denomination. There would be a service of inauguration and a reordination of all the ministers, and then a plan for the merger of the denomination on the national level and at the local level. And that's as far as it got. We could agree on so much, but to agree on how we're going to be organized and administered became a bridge too far. We as Episcopalians in 1970 had come right up to the edge of a full merger with these other mainline denominations, but dismantling our administrative apparatus on the diocesan and national level was simply too much. And so the merger was voted down, and eventually no participants actually carried through with the forming of the Churches of Christ Uniting. Well, since that time, we've continued bilateral ecumenical work. We have full communion with the Lutheran Church. We have full communion with the Moravian Church. We're on the verge of having full communion once again with the Methodist Church. But rather than a combined effort, we've been doing that work bilaterally. And during the 1990s, under the leadership of our presiding Bishop Frank Griswold, in some ways, we turned our back a bit on Protestant ecumenical efforts because Frank was such a devout Anglo-Catholic that he worked very hard to try to open dialogue with the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. But our positions on gays in the ministry and women in the ministry led to that not really resulting in any kind of combined effort. So today, when we talk about the mainline denominations, they were no longer the mainstream Christian expression. Today, we make up 15% of Americans. Roman Catholics represent 25%. Evangelicals in various flavors represent 30%. And the remaining 30% of Americans are non-Christian or other different kind of Christian bodies. For example, the Mormon Church, which we're going to discuss next week when we talk about some homegrown religions, they have 7 million members, which is more than 3 times the number of Episcopalians. It's interesting, though, there was just a brand new Gallup poll that showed that for the first time, only 48% of Americans identify as a member of a congregation. They still identify as Christian, but they no longer identify as a member of a particular congregation. So we're living in the 21st century into a whole new day of religious expression. So I think I'll stop there. I've been going on a long time about this. I was talking with my wife and saying, boy, last week talking about the Acoma Pueblo and Cortez and Coronado, it was going to be a little white bread to turn over to the churches in Pennsylvania's main line. But finding that example of First Pres and thinking of other examples, and for me, where my heart is in the social gospel, it was a fascinating research project to get ready for this week. So what you can do now is anybody that wants to can unmute themselves. If Ruth Ann, I don't know if Ruth Ann's still there, whether she can field questions from the live audience.
Pete, I have a question.
Okay.
Early on in your talk, you said, you talked about the number of people who were Protestants, and then you said the remaining were Catholic and other. Does that mean that in the 1920s, there were more Protestant Christians in the United States than Catholic Christians?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
And
immigration, there were only, well, I would have to go back and look at the time when, because you lump all of us together. I think the Roman Catholic Church had the plurality of Christians even by the 1910s and 1920s because of immigration from primarily Catholic nations. But the totality, there were more mainline Protestants than there were Catholics, for sure.
And that's always, actually, that's always been the heritage. I'm, Bobby's faith, and
Yeah.
I'm quite familiar with Mark Matthews' history.
Oh.
And his church is about to be demolished, the second generation. The Presbyterian church on the corner, well, right, on the edge of the freeway, has lost its congregation significantly. And it will soon be demolished for an office building.
Oh.
There are some beautiful stained glass windows in their chapel there.
Oh, wow.
But he was a very divisive figure in Seattle.
Very much so.
And really lost his great following and his direction as identification, as you have described him, Peter, because he was the leader for prohibition.
Right.
And of course, Seattle was not a well-church. We're not a church part of the United States. There were hardly 2 people scraped together here in the church world until the Alaska Gold Rush brought the East Coast middle class and intelligentsia class. So anyway, and of course, the Methodist Church was the church of the frontier was the Church of the Oregon Trail. And
Right.
that was the prominent church in the West here. Well,
Very
anyway, but Mark Matthews was a fire-breathing prohibitionist, and his wife was a member of the Sunset Club, very prestigious ladies group. And once the 20s got going, he really lost his way.
Well, and you know, that prohibition was at the heart of a lot of the social gospel. I mean, and so
No
many,
doubt. Yeah.
when you look back to see the overlap of abolitionists and prohibitionists, I mean, and it's a fascinating study to look at which one foregrounded which issue, feminism or prohibition.
And prohibition lost the war and everything else in the 20s. And by the way, Seattle and Tacoma voted wet when the state voted dry in 1916.
But I think you're showing really the power of this social interaction of the church in the community.
Yes.
That they got an amendment passed to the Constitution to outlaw alcohol.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God. I mean, think of the national organizing it would take to ever pull that off.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, Mike?
Can you say something about a couple things? The Methodists seem to be on a slow road to schism over gays.
Yeah.
Say something about all this sex in Lutheranism. Wyatt grew up Wisconsin Synod Lutheran. And I'm not sure how that all developed in this country.
Oh, you mean the different kinds of Lutheranism?
Yeah.
Or the, okay.
Yeah.
Well, on the Methodists, you know, it's interesting. We're the Episcopal Church. You know, our old name used to be the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. Therefore, our denomination can make its own decision about full inclusion of gays in the ministry. The Methodist Church does not have national bodies. For the policies of the Methodist Church to change, they have to convince globally their denomination. And so that's put the American Methodist Church leading to schism, where they might merge with us, they might form a new denomination, but that's what that's why they've been stifled on so many issues, because the majority of their membership is African. And as we found in our debates, the African church is very, I don't want to say homophobic, but very much against full inclusion of gays. And so that's what the Methodists have been up against. And you're right, they're on the verge of pulling out, and then they'll get into those same battles that we got into over property and standing. But I would say the majority of Methodists in this country share values and opinions close to ours, but that's not the deciding factor. They have to win worldwide. The Lutherans, Lutheranism coming to America was a German and Scandinavian phenomenon. There were no Lutherans in England. There were no, and the way that German migration happened, at least where I lived in Ohio, is 10 male elders would come and shop and find the farmland, and then they would bring their entire village. They'd bring 800 people, and they would speak German, and they would worship in German, and they would stay in German. There was that was also true somewhat of some of the Reformed churches coming out of Germany. So Lutheranism didn't become mainline until after around World War I, when they began to realize we cannot maintain a German identity in a country that's at war with Germany. And so there was an evolution. So their story is a very unique story. Now, I don't know the history of, I do know a little bit of the history of the merger of the Lutheran Church, which is now called the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. That was the ALC and the LCA. That, it's overstated, but that was basically a merger of the Scandinavian branches of the church with the German branches. But the Missouri Synod, I'm not sure how long ago that started, but they are by far the most conservative branch of Lutheranism in this country. And there's
the Church of the Lutheran Confession, which is more far right than that.
Okay. And there's
Peter?
1.9 million Missouri Synod Lutherans and 3.8 ELCA Lutherans. So a third of Lutherans in this country are Missouri Synod.
Peter, don't
Yeah.
forget the impact of the Civil War on the Lutheran Church, because they actually separated governance wise, and that's why there's Southern Methodist University. And I believe the Lutherans, the Missouri Synod group got separated out. If you'll know, my last name is Spaeth. If you would dig it, and that's my married name, my husband's family were involved in the formation of the Evangelical Church of America, and were German Lutherans who had the audacity to send their son, and was hired by a St. Olaf's, and they weren't so sure about a German guy teaching in their
Scandinavian
Norwegian language, so that went on for a long time after the Civil War. But basically there was a Civil War effect on the Lutheran Church.
And actually, all 7 of these denominations, except for us, divided into Southern and Northern denominations.
Right.
And we were the only church that kept it together. We had a general convention in the middle of the war that was boycotted by the South. But the first general convention after the Civil War, we went back to being a unified body. Now, that's both something to be proud of, but also something to wonder about. But you're right. I mean, that's like the Presbyterians, I think, their division. And that's also why the American Baptist Church and the Southern Baptist Church became 2 entirely different bodies, was because of the Civil War.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have a question about the influence of Harry Emerson Fosdick on the development of mainline Christianity in the 20th century. Can you speak to that?
Well, yes, a little bit. I mean, Fosdick became a national figure. And he was, I would call him an apologist for the tradition within the modernist church. He wasn't a fundamentalist, but he did think that our church was getting the churches were getting way too secular. And he was at the time when mass media was starting to create figures such as him. A little later on, Norman Vincent Peale is another example of a pan-denominational national figure who was trying, and I think both Fosdick and Peale were saying, let's don't get down into the weeds of doctrine and judgment, but let's do keep that spirit that there is in the church. I forget what Fosdick's years would have been, but I think he was active in the 20s, wasn't he?
I think so, or early 30s.
The first one before him was Henry Ward Beecher. I mean, he really became the first sort of national preacher, and he was a very important figure in moving towards modernism and his gospel of love. Well, if you'll remember, he got a little bit in too much.
He got in trouble for that.
Yeah,
on a personal basis.
That gospel of love when he was held on trial for visiting one of his New York ladies a little too often.
That's right.
But those are important figures. Henry Ward Beecher, Fosdick, Peale, of this sort of unified Protestantism that still has this positive, progressive view. But he in no way was a full modernist. I mean, he wasn't into German biblical scholarship. He was into emotional good preaching. Yes, Jerry.
Peter,
Yes.
what is the best book that you would recommend on the history of Christianity?
Oh, wow.
Or
Well, the best, I mean, if you're really going to be a student of it, the best is Sidney Alstrom's A History of Christianity in America. It's 1,100 pages.
Oh,
But what's fun about it, you can go into the index and find almost any strain, and there will be a very erudite discussion of that. So that book is, I think, worth having. It's a little oppressive, but I think still that would be my favorite. And it's certainly the one I go back to getting ready for this. I don't know, Dan, do you have a favorite book that sort of is, there's a new survey from the Oxford Press that I think is simply called Christianity, that again is sort of encyclopedic so that you can delve in where you want to delve in.
Well, I would
Thank
say,
you.
I like Bob Pritchard's old book, I think is quite good.
Okay.
It's dated because I read it in seminary, so that gives you an idea. And I also like, if you want like tools to help you reading, well, this is a different topic. I was thinking like with scripture things. I just became a member of Bible Gateway, and they have a special membership on top of the free Bible translations you can get, which is fantastic for Bible reading, but that isn't what we're talking about. So as you can see, I'm like, oh, and by the way, Pete, and everyone, I really apologize. I muted everyone except for myself. So when we were trying to let people in, that's why. And Pete was like, you know, really,
Oh, no, I hardly noticed
you are a
it.
star.
No.
Sorry about the mess up there, guys. I usually mute myself right away.
I'll tell you, the book I need to find is the one to get ready for the class 2 weeks from now, of what the heck has become of Christianity since 1970. And, you know, I can tell you a lot about the Episcopal Church since 1970, but to really try to understand, you know, Jerry Falwell and Franklin Graham and all that stuff, and its interplay with American politics. You know, I saw this week how important the interplay of American politics and the mainline churches were. Now I got to do some homework in the next 2 weeks to get ready for how they hijack the brand to make, you know, Christianity synonymous with conservatism. So
Pete,
Kay had a question for you, Peter.
okay.
Yes. Peter, I apologize. We came in late. It's really hard to get here on time after the 8:45 service, but we are so interested in your classes that we try. But we missed what the 7 branches of the Protestant denominations are.
Okay.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, this is in order of size. So the largest is the United Methodist Church, then the Evangelical Lutheran Church, then the Episcopal Church, then the Presbyterian Church USA, the American Baptist Church, the United Church of Christ, and then the Christian Church, which is also called the Disciples of Christ.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So could you also go review the three things about the disciple of Christ?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I love that slogan that they have. Let me find it here.
Started with the essential, this
Right,
unit.
in essentials. Okay, this became their creed and really all that you had to accept if you were a disciple. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. And in all things, charity.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're sort of at time, aren't we?
We are. We could probably
Okay.
take one more question.
Okay.
If anyone had it?
Pete, I just wanted to comment, since you're in Florida, that this winter we've had quite a few television advertisements by Franklin Graham here in our market, telling us to come back to God and call this number. And it's been very interesting that he's been, well, it's been pretty common on the television.
He made a huge buy on CNN. They invested a ton on CNN, and he was, I read a little bit about that. He runs a health ministry called Samaritan's Purse. And I don't know if you remember, but they got the contract to set up the field hospitals in New York City. And St. John the Divine agreed to provide their sanctuary for a field hospital. But then when they found out that it was Samaritan's Purse who was going to be the purveyor of the effort, the Bishop of New York wouldn't allow it because of Samaritan's Purse's stand on gays and women and other things. So yeah, Franklin Graham made a big push in this time to try to get back, and he spent a lot of money to advertise on CNN. So.
And I think that the
advertising for
Bishop of New
Lambreth.
York, since I'm officially still there, I have to change my my residency. But he did ask them if they would just have it be based like any other hospital and have no. So he was willing to work with Samaritan's Purse as long as they didn't stop people from entering that they were opposed to or whatever.
Yeah, or proselytize, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, next week we got 2 more weeks to go. Next week we're going to do homegrown religions: the Mormons, the Adventists, the Oneida community, the Christian Scientists, those things that sort of grew out of only American soil, Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes.
So that'll be a fun one. And then our last week, we'll take a look at the influence of Christianity in American politics since 1970. So see you next week.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.